Well, hello, everyone. I have the distinct honor of being able to interview my friend here in Southwest Florida, Mr. Bill Federer, William Federer. I just wanted to give you a little bit of his background for those of you that don't know about him. I've enjoyed Bill's work for years now. And the primary, before I put a face to the author's name, the primary function of Bill's works for me were to supply that missing history that just doesn't get reported so that connections can be made. If contrast clarifies, then we need to be able to see and compare and be able to get more clarity in that way. But just a couple of things he's done. First, I wanted to make you aware of his website, The American Minute. Every day there's something posted. This is where you can get his works. He's published over 20 books. I want to give you my favorites out of them, The 10 Commandments and Their Influence on American Law. An excellent, excellent work. 3 Secular Reasons Why America Should Be Under God, and What Every American Needs to Know About the Quran, A History of Islam in the United States. His current book is called Socialism, From Plato to the Present. Is that correct? And that's what we're going to be talking about today, and seeing just where the research and his research has taken him more recently. He's a former congressional candidate. Bill has appeared on almost every major media outlet at some point. C-SPAN, Fox, Hannity and Combs, The O'Reilly Factor, NPR, MSNBC, ABC, Time Warner affiliates, all of them, CBN, TBN, the whole grab bag of alphabetized media purveyors. Many publications, been featured in USA Today, Human Events, the New York Times. Well, I bet that's a story. Washington Times, the Washington Post, Roll Call, Harper's Magazine. And I thought this is such a timely interview to try to talk about his new research and his new book. So welcome. It's great to have you.
Well, Dr. Joe, it's great to be with you, and I'm a big fan of all that you're doing.
Well, we're trying.
You're a great leader.
Thank you.
You're brilliant,
Thank
and the
you.
Lord is using you in a powerful way.
We're just glad to have you, brother. Glad to have you. He's also attended our church from time to time, so this has been great to have Bill. So let's just jump right in if you're okay. Yeah. So you're based on your recent research, if you had to place the locus of the problem, do you think it's a capitalism socialism problem, or is it a human heart problem? And for Christians, we lean towards the human heart problem. So do you want to expand on that question? It is an economic issue, but it's more fundamental than that, isn't it?
Right. So human beings are selfish. It's the sin nature.
Absolutely.
It's the default setting for human behavior, and it goes back to Adam and Eve sinning and Cain killing Abel. And so you put some babies in a playpen, one takes the rattle. You put some kids in a playground, one's the bully hogging the ball. You put some people in the woods, one of them is an Indian chief, put them in an inner city, one of them is a gang leader. And all a king is a glorified gang leader. And as the centuries go on, the kingdoms get bigger, because with military advancements, you can kill more people. So instead of killing with a rock, you kill with a bronze weapon or an iron weapon or a phalanx spear the Greeks had, or a scimitar sword that the Muslims had, or a composite bow that the Mongols had, or gunpowder. The weapon changes, but all it does is magnify what's in the fallen, selfish human heart.
Wow.
Now, the gospel regenerates our heart, right? It's in a sense like a new behavioral software program.
Excellent.
And you know, when and Peter got the download on the day of Pentecost, right? I mean, from the cloud,
right?
And so now he's operating with a new system. He goes from denying Christ, and all of a sudden he's bold for Christ. He's got a new operating system going on here.
Absolutely.
And then this begins to spread, right? And this software program goes, and Jesus says the wheat and tares grow together till the harvest.
Amen.
But you can see that what the gospel does is empowers the individual by having a personal relationship with God. In the Old Testament too, where it says that every person is made in the image of God. So there's this concept of equality, not because you're a particular race or sex or nationality, just by virtue of you being in the image of God. Now, whenever you get a pyramid structure, you got a king, it changes. Your life is only of worth if the king says so. So the closer you get to pleasing the king, your value goes up. And if you challenge the king, your value goes down, and ultimately you're a slave and you're killed. It's called treason. And so America's founders broke away from the most powerful king on the planet, the King of England, and they flipped it and made the people the king. So the word citizen means co-king. A republic is where the citizens are king ruling through representatives.
Gotcha.
So when we pledge allegiance to the flag and to the republic, we're basically pledging allegiance to us being in charge of ourselves.
Wow.
So when somebody protests the flag, what they're effectively saying is, I don't want to be the king anymore. I protest this system where I participate in ruling myself.
Wow.
Anyway, so the dilemma is that human nature wants to concentrate. St. Augustine called it libido dominandi, the lust to dominate. And what our founders did is they looked back to the Reformation model and ultimately the period of Israel before they got King Saul.
Wow.
It's called the Hebrew Republic period.
Gotcha. Wow.
Anyway, well, that's sort of a big overview of world history.
Beautiful.
And in particular with socialism, socialism is basically reverting back to the top-down pyramid. And it's a ruling class and a ruled class, and I can get into it more with Plato.
Absolutely, and even going back to the book right before, am I correct, was Who's the King in America? Great. We got a full Sunday school slate of that beautiful, great book, but a wonderful complement to this sort of thing. You talk about that rubber band analogy that you're so fond of. So just a practical question. I know, again, this is a gotcha question. You've probably been asked this before, but practically, can a Christian be a socialist? I mean, is that something, I mean, I guess technically they could, but can they be a consistent one, do you think?
Well, Karl Marx explained that socialism is a transition phase between capitalism and communism. So it's a road to an end. It's socialism is communism light.
Right.
And so it was Marx who said, communism can be summed up in one sentence: the abolition of private property. Well, the Bible talks all about private property. When the children of Israel come into the promised land, the land is divided up and given as private property to each family. And two of the commandments specifically says, you shall not covet somebody else's property.
Right.
And you shall not steal somebody else's property, which implies that the somebody else owns property.
Personal possession.
Then when Ananias and Sapphira sell their land and bring it to the apostles, and they lie, and but Peter says, when it was yours, you owned it, and it was yours to sell.
Wow.
So he's affirming that.
Yes.
And then you see that David bought, instead of him confiscating the place to build the temple from our whatever the gentleman's name was,
yes.
that owned the threshing floor of Onan or whatever it was, but instead of him confiscating it, he insisted on purchasing it from him.
Another example of that assumption of personal property, personal possession.
And then there's Naboth's vineyard,
right,
where Ahab goes to Naboth and says, I want to buy your land. And he goes, no, this is my family's land, and I'm not going to sell it.
Sure.
And then so when you own property, you can be moved upon in your heart to give some of your property.
There you go.
That is called charity.
Voluntarily.
And it is the basis of the biblical faith. So God is really into voluntary stuff. He doesn't force you to be a Christian. He gives you the choice to voluntarily. And so there's the people in the wilderness following Moses, and Moses says, whoever is moved upon on your heart to bring stuff to build a tabernacle. And so people are moved upon to give of their private possessions to build the ark, give their jewels and their cloth and all the different things to build it.
Yeah.
But it was voluntary.
Big.
When David is collecting the material to build the temple, he gets the leaders of Israel together and he goes, I'm going to give 3,000 talents of gold. What do you guys want to do? And it says that they were moved upon in their heart, and they gave 5,000 talents plus a bunch of others. And David says, well, Lord, everything we have was yours. You gave it to us, and we're just giving it back to you. So in other words, all God's interested in is your will, and your will is expressed through the giving of material things. And then when they come back from having been captive in Babylon, again, those that are moved upon in their heart donated money. Socialism is the government taking from you. You don't have a choice about it. And the dilemma is whenever the government gives to the poor, those programs are run by bureaucrats and politicians that want to keep their jobs. And so they tend to want to be discretionary in how they give it out. So they'll funnel the benefits to those that can vote them back in office, and they'll withhold the benefits from those that want to reduce the size of government. And so all of this together is called the deep state. So you have this big bureaucratic blob that basically wants to perpetuate itself.
Gotcha.
And there's a quote from Booker T. Washington. He goes, there's some race problem solvers that don't want the patient to get well.
Yes,
In
absolutely.
other words, if the poor are no longer poor, then my job of distributing stuff to the poor is no longer needed, and I'm working myself out of a job. So they want to say that they want to help the poor, but in reality, they want the poor to continue to exist.
Wow.
And but when Christians help the poor,
Sure.
they give them a message that says, you can do all things through Christ who strengthens you. You can improve your position. Matter of fact, you can improve it so much that you can then give to help other people.
Right.
And but it comes back down to free will. So Jesus would not be in favor of the government forcibly taking stuff away from people and redistributing it to those who can keep the politicians in office. And so when the apostles started the church, it says that some were moved upon in their heart to sell their property and bring the money to the feet of who? Pilate?
Nope.
Did they say, hey, Pilate, here's a little more money for you to spread the Roman government around? No, they brought it to the feet of the church, the feet of the apostles. And so one of the things I point out in the book is God gives commands to 5 groups. Individuals, families, employees, church, and government. There are commands for the individual to take care of the poor, visit the sick, and so forth. There's no commands for the family to take care of the poor. The commands to the family are husbands, love your wives, children, submit to your parents, so forth. There's no commands for employers or employees to take care of the poor. Those commands are do an honest day's work and don't hold back wages. There are commands for the church to take care of the poor. And historically, the church has. And almost all the hospitals were started by churches, and schools were started by churches, and digging wells in villages and giving away clothes and vaccinations, all churches. There are no commands for the government to take care of the poor. The command to the government is the shortest. Protect the innocent, punish the guilty. What's happened over time, especially after FDR and the Great Depression, and especially Lyndon Johnson's welfare state, is the government has usurped the church's role.
Gotcha.
And so there's a quote from Calvin Coolidge who says, just because something needs to be done does not mean it's the government's job to do it.
Amen.
You need to take care of the poor. Yeah, but it's not the government's job. It's the church's job.
Sure.
You want to donate money, and then the person receiving it is grateful.
Right.
Whereas if the government gives money, the person receiving it considers it a debt owed to them.
Wow.
And then there's another psychological attitude that kicks in. When somebody continues to receive free stuff, after a while, they begin to feel bad about themselves.
Yeah.
And they end up channeling that negative feeling toward the people that's making them feel bad.
Absolutely.
In other words, the government they end up hating the very government that is giving them free stuff.
It's amazing. It's
And so, but if the church gives, they're grateful, and that develops a relationship within the body, and then the person is encouraged to improve their condition, and then they're in a position to help others, and the church can grow.
That's one of the most shocking things I've discovered of late, too, both anecdotally and historically, is that same idea, the hand, you bite the hand that feeds you eventually. Whether it's American troops stationed in Germany to do something unique amongst nations and help a nation you've defeated off its knees, or in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, this sort of continued free support becomes resentment on behalf of the recipients, which is why I've seen it at an anecdotal level and a wider level, just an interesting psychological turn when these sort of things happen. Not only you start feeling bad about yourself, but resenting the person that's actually giving you something because some sort of a odd like superiority in some way. So excellent. I'm sure we could talk. Yeah.
One other parable,
Yes.
Talents. One is given 1, the other is given 2, and the other 5. and they multiply them. And then Jesus, gives in the parable, says, look, take the one from the one guy and give it to the guy who multiplied it and has the 10. And the servants say, well, Master, he already has 10. He goes, yeah.
Right.
In other words, the one that is not doing anything, that's lazy, take it away and give it to the one that's industrious, that's creative, that's innovative, that's hardworking. Wow. So the scriptures are very clear that God blesses those that can do something, and those that don't, he takes away. This is different than socialism. Socialism would say, okay, take from the guy that's got 10 talents and divide them up equally amongst the others. Jesus didn't say that.
No, he didn't. And like I said, there's so much more that could be said, but just one more expansion, if you don't mind, and this isn't even what we talked about, but I hope it's going to be okay. You did point to the fact that this could fundamentally affect what the founders were intending if you have someone that's voting out of the corporate purse for votes to keep them in power, that deep state comment. Do you have anything else to say about that idea that this certainly would be something that would minimally alarm the founders who labored quite extensively to try to look at all sorts of monarchies and all sorts of democracies and even mobocracies through history to see what combination under God might work?
Yeah, and again, this goes back to Plato,
right,
where he talked about that a leader will be tempted to take and tax money away from his political opponents and funnel it as handouts to his political supporters.
Wow.
It's sort of like in a military operation during the Revolutionary War. Every now and then they would capture a ship of the British supplies. And instead of those supplies supplying the British, they would capture them and use them to. So that's what the government does, is it takes money away from those who are challenging those in power, and it funnels it as benefits to those who want to keep the person in power.
Wow.
But you're back to this pyramid. The guy in power wants to stay in power.
Of course. Human nature, right? Okay, so we're going to enter a segment here where I read a portion of the book, Socialism, from Plato to the Present, and then Bill's just going to comment, or not even respond, but comment and augment these comments. So this is a first quote. The World Future Fund Research Project wrote this in an article called Totalitarianism, Past, Present, and Future Policy Case Statement. Here's the quote. The term totalitarianism was invented by Mussolini, but the philosophy it represents is actually thousands of years old. The centralization of political power and control of citizens by an authoritarian state are political trends that date back to the dawn of history. In the ancient world, in both the East and the West, totalitarianism evolved into a highly elaborate system of philosophy. Kind of what we were just discussing, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, and you got Pharaoh saying, unless you serve me, you got to throw your babies in the river, right? Wow. You got Nebuchadnezzar saying, when I blow those trumpets, you bow to my statue. Wow. They want you to basically sell your soul, and your life and your worth is dependent on how well you serve the deep state, the person at the top. If you challenge them, you disappear, right?
Absolutely.
You're suicided or something.
Absolutely, yes. Again, lots there. Next quote from Calvin Coolidge. This dates to 1924. Note the date. Quote, there are only two main theories of government in the world. One rests on righteousness, the other rests on force. One appeals to reason, the other appeals to the sword. One is exemplified in a republic, the other is represented by despotism. The history of government on this earth has been almost entirely a history of the rule of force held in the hands of few. Under our Constitution, America committed itself to the power, putting the power in the hands of the people.
You take the power of a king, you separate it into the hands of the people, it's chaos. Unless each person is taught the law, and the Levites in ancient Israel were sort of like, I use the example.
The app, yes.
Yeah.
I love it.
That you imagine if everybody, instead of a GPS app, had a behavioral app.
Right.
In real, you know how the GPS can tell you 500 feet ahead turn? So it's actually watching you in real time. Right. Imagine a behavioral app that watches you in real time and says, now don't steal that. Now don't lose your temper at that person. Watch out, right? And so the law, in Israel's case, the Levites were like the computer geeks that help you to download this app.
Wow.
right? Go to Google Play and the Apple Store and press this button here, line upon line, precept upon precept. So everybody would download this and they'd have it in their heart.
Right.
But then the big question is, why would you follow it?
Right.
What would actually motivate you to follow an internal moral? And Israel had the key ingredient. There's a God who's watching everyone. He wants you to be fair, and he's going to hold you accountable in the future. Huge. So you're about to steal, nobody's around, and then you think, God is watching me. He wants me to be fair. He's going to hold me accountable in the future. Maybe I should hesitate stealing. Wow. So it creates something in your head called a conscience. If everybody in the country really believes this, you can maintain complete order with no police. So you want to get rid of police? Fine. Just have a teeter-totter. If you're going to get rid of the outside law enforcement, you have to increase the internal law. Amen. You have to get people to go back to reading the Bible, and then what causes them to follow the internal law is you're accountable to this God of the Bible. Amen. And it only works with the God of the Bible. An Islamic Allah God says there's an infidel woman there, you can rape her, you can steal it from this infidel, lie to the other. The God of the Bible says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So the system would take the power of the king, separated it, it's chaos, as each person is taught the law, they follow the law because they're accountable to the God of the Bible.
Now, just to play devil's advocate, you are, is this, you sound Zionist to me. You're making this direct connection to the Hebrews and to the Bible, and is that, you're being intentional here, because that's the only other, I think, if I get your books right, it's the only other bottom-up example we have, really, at that level.
Right, so in having studied, I actually spent a year or so going through every single century of recorded human history, from the Assyrians and Babylonians and Greeks and so forth, and the most common form of government's a king, but there's one anomaly that stands out like a sore thumb, and it's ancient Israel. So when they come out of Egypt around 1400 BC, and their first 400 years, they do not have a king. It's totally against human nature. Absolutely. They had no king, and it works because every single citizen is taught the law. And when the priests stopped teaching the law, it says every man did what was right in their own eyes, turns into this chaos, and then in that chaos they all go to Samuel the prophet, and they say this self-government system's not working. We want to be like all the other countries. We want a king, and the rubber band snaps back. Now, it's interesting because the monarchs of Europe quoted from the Bible from King Saul on to justify God's anointed king. Right. The Protestant reformers looked at ancient Israel from the period before King Saul, right? So they're both quoting from the Bible. But the original plan that God gave to the nation of Israel was this 400-year period where they did not have a king, and every single person was taught the law. Then they had complete freedom. They had their own property, and I go through, everybody was armed, and every man was in the militia and so forth. But when they stopped teaching the internal morals, that's when they demanded, but it's interesting because basically the top down versus bottom up is the division in the Bible between pre-King Saul and post-King Saul. And
notice he does very uniquely warn them, I'm going to give you what you want with a king, but you're not going to like it. I'm going to tell you right now, I'm going to give this to you out of the hardness of your heart. You're going to have, you've been asking for this. Maybe the only way you can learn to not follow your pagan neighbors is by getting one.
Yeah, and then lightning came and thunder and destroyed their crops, and the people said, we sinned in asking for a king. He goes, yeah, you did, but God will still work his plan out anyway,
Very good. Next quote, British statesman, one of my favorite of all time, Edmund Burke. This is from 1791. Listen to this quote. What is liberty without virtue? It is the greatest of all possible evils. Madness without restraint. Men are qualified for civil liberty in exact proportion to their disposition to put moral chains on their own appetites. Society cannot exist unless there's a controlling power upon will and appetite to be placed somewhere, and the less of it there is within, the more of it has to be without. So again, just what you've been saying.
Yeah, I use the illustration of a parent with a teenager saying, here are the car keys, you're a good kid, you have internal morals, you can come home whenever. But if you don't follow those internal morals, you hang around the wrong kids, drink and drive and party, you will be pulled over by the police and controlled behind bars. So teenager, you are going to be controlled, either voluntarily from the inside or forcibly from the outside. It's the same way with a nation.
Gotcha.
We're either going to be voluntarily controlled with internal morals, and we're motivated to follow these internal morals because we're accountable to the God of the Bible, or we're going to say there is no more God.
Right.
These laws are just made up by some old men.
You're right.
And we're going to teach the kids there's no right, there's no wrong. You don't even know if you're a boy or a girl anymore. That you can kill the baby in your womb, you can justify any action. And then we put these kids out on the street, and then there's lawlessness. And we're like, oh, what do we do now? And that's when the people cry, we need a strong leader to restore order, and boom, the power concentrates back into the hands of a king.
Wow. Yes, next quote. This is from Will and Ariel Durant in their outstanding book. They quote Plato here in Lessons from History, or Lessons of History. Listen. The Democrats contemptuously rejected temperance. Citizens chafe impatiently at the least touch of authority, and at length they cease to care even if the laws, written or unwritten. And this is fair and a glorious beginning, out of which springs dictatorship, tyrannus. The excessive increase of anything causes a reaction in the opposite direction, and so the dictatorship naturally arises out of democracy, and the most aggravated form of tyranny and slavery out of the most extreme form of liberty. Now that's a mouthful, but somebody, Plato's saying, look, sometimes the seeds of its own demise are in democracy, if it's a pure democracy or a mobocracy. Comment?
Yeah, well, you know, the French Revolution, they wanted to have republic, liberté, fraternité, equalité, and so forth. And, but they didn't want God. They decided to not have their constitution done in the year of the Lord, so they made 1792 the New Year One. They did not want a 7-day week with a Sabbath rest because it went back to the Bible. So they came up with a 10-day week, a decade week. Each day had 10 hours, each hour had 100 minutes, each minute had 100 seconds. They said 10 was the number of man because you count with 10 fingers. And so they made every measurement in France divisible by 10. They called it the metric system. Maybe that's why I never really liked the metric. They turned churches into temples of reason. They put a prostitute in Notre Dame Cathedral, covered her with a sheet, said this is a goddess of reason, let's worship her. It was an intentional effort, and they chop off 40,000 heads in Paris. And out of this chaos eventually comes a dictator named Napoleon. Right? And so they said, okay, we're going to have this wonderful thing, but there's going to be no morals. The bottom fell out, and out of that chaos, they get an emperor, Napoleon. So when the democracy without morals and virtue end in chaos, out of which people are willing to accept a dictator.
Wow. Wow. So respond to this. This is from your book. This is your commentary in between some quotes. Preceding the Pilgrims, there were Reformation and Puritan scholars. You made reference to the Reformation with regard to the kings and what they were quoting and when and how of the Bible. They look back to the Old Testament and Israel's covenant. Talk to us a little bit about covenant and the New Testament idea of ecclesia. You want to talk a little bit about covenant and ecclesia?
Right. So a covenant is people in agreement with each other, but it's more than that.
Sure.
It's people covenanted to help take care of each other and help encourage each other, suffer together, weep together, so forth. And you get your rights from God, you're accountable to God. So it's sort of like a triangle. That's the Pilgrims, and they got that from ancient Israel.
Okay.
In the next century after the Pilgrims is called the Age of Enlightenment, and covenant turns into social contract. And it's just people in agreement with each other.
Right.
And you get your rights from the group, you're accountable to the group. If God is there, he is distant. This came from the scientific revolution where Isaac Newton discovered there's laws of planetary motion, laws of gravity, laws of optics, Robert Boyle discovering laws of pressure. And some of the theologians said, well, gee, maybe God made the laws, and like a guy winds up a clock and sets it on a shelf, everything just follows these laws. And so if God is there, he's impersonal.
Deism.
The ultimate of this is that God is just some impersonal force. So we go from Pilgrims having a covenant to Age of Enlightenment social contract with a distant God. Next century, it's the French Revolution, social contract with no God.
Right.
They intentionally want to get rid of God. In the next century, it turns into Marxism and socialism, where the state is God.
Wow.
You get your rights from the state, you're accountable to the state, and Hegel said the state is God walking on earth. One of the writers was named Rousseau. He said, if the state says to an individual, it is expedient for the state that you should die, that individual ought to die because his life is a gift made conditionally by the state. So once you get rid of God, your worth comes from the state. And so Eisenhower gave a good quote. He said, in some countries, the state claims to be the source of human rights. If the state gives rights, creator in order to make our revolutionary experiment make sense. In other words, we had to go above the government's head and say, government, we get rights from a source higher than you.
Right.
As a matter of fact, it's your job to protect our God-given rights.
Absolutely.
But if there is no God, the government says, I'm the source of your rights. And so that's where you get these totalitarian dictatorships. And Stalin, killed millions and killed Ukrainians and starved them to death. And Pol Pot killed a third of Cambodia. He said, to keep you is no benefit, to lose you is no loss. You had Mao Zedong responsible for 80 million deaths in China. And so wherever there's just the state and there's no God, the state can kill lots of people.
I knew there'd be a time we'd get to Hobbes, and then you had to move to Rousseau if we're tracking a trajectory like this. Do you, you make we'll make another move after them beyond social contract and beyond, the inherent goodness of man and that sort of thing. Do you find that it's, we're never too far gone. I'm probably getting ahead of us here on this, but given the Holy Spirit, there's always a chance, correct? The revival's always there on the table as a possibility. You want to comment on that idea that, it probably felt like to a lot of Christians in that era, the post-Enlightenment era, like things were getting pretty bad with regard to people's understanding of these things. So even where we are now, which is far more extreme than even that, what would you say there's still hope?
Yes, there's always hope. And matter of fact, God has, He puts us in these situations intentionally. Right. What am I talking about? Yeah. So you look at history, every single generation has a crisis. And the crisis is an opportunity for people to be put into pressure situations where they reveal what is really in their heart. And they can choose to be, so you got Attila the Hun, Genghis Khan, bubonic plague, you got Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. You have all these different periods that you and I could have been living in. And every one of those has a crisis, and every one of those is those that are following the Lord are pushed up to, are you going to bow to the statue when Nebuchadnezzar blows the trumpet? Are you going to, pinch incense to the statue of, Julius Caesar?
Absolutely.
And so the crisis of the generation is an opportunity for us to show what's in our heart. And it's like you don't know what's in a toothpaste tube until you squeeze it.
Absolutely.
And I tell people, and it's sort of a theme in a whole lot of the romance novels. A girl has a guy that she thinks, really, cares about him, but then this guy is put into a situation where he has to choose his career over her. And what it does is the situation reveals that this guy really loves his job more than her.
Right.
And then there's another guy who's willing to give up everything for her. And so this is sort of the theme.
Yes.
And, God knew what was in Abraham's heart. Certainly God knows everything. But yet He wanted to see Abraham take his son Isaac to the top of Mount Moriah and be willing to kill him. Absolutely. And of course God stopped him. But God knows what's in each of our hearts. Yeah, but He wants to hear some words out of your mouth, and He wants to see some actions.
Absolutely.
I tell people, imagine a guy's sitting there watching football on TV on the couch, and you go up to him and say, have you told your wife you love her recently? No, but she knows my heart. It's like, okay, have you done anything to show your wife you love her recently? No, but she knows my heart. It's like, dude,
Right.
It's like God knows what's in your heart. Yes, He does.
Right.
And He wants to hear some words out of your mouth, and He wants to see some actions. And the crisis of the era is us being put in a position where we can show what's in our heart. Are we going to be part of the problem? Are we going to ignore the problem? Or are we going to try to minister God's love to a lost and dying world? Are we going to defend the defenseless, the orphan and the widow? Are we going to stand up for biblical morality? Are we going to, stand up for righteousness? Or are we going to, so this is our choice, and the wheat and tares grow together till the harvest.
Absolutely.
History does repeat itself, but each time it comes around, it's a little bit worse. The stakes get bigger, they all take on more of a global aspect to them. But nevertheless, the devil does something worse, God does something better. The devil, and it's going to go that way until, Jesus says the wheat and tares grow together till the harvest. It's going to keep doing this stair step up until the time he wraps up the whole thing.
I'm reminded, back when I was doing more campus work, we try to use persuasion to evangelize, and the point you made about the Imago Dei being a direct connection to God's image, and therefore that being vouchsafed but not defined or underwritten, defended by the state but not underwritten by the state, is admitted even by some of the best and brightest out there. You read something like Harvard's most famous lawyer, Alan Dershowitz, shouting fire. He's talking about this problem. I want to say morals and value, which is how you value somebody else and yourself, is more than just created by the state. That can't be the case, but I don't want to go to that transcendent point either, because I'm an agnostic atheist. John Gray, London School of Economics, same thing. We atheists are living off the borrowed capital of the Christians everywhere. Some of the more uniquely Christian ideals are what got placed into the government as instead of it just being a bunch of guys in powdered wigs that decided at one point and can take it away. So even the best and brightest are willing to analyze and see that sort of the very same thing you're talking about.
Well, you're brilliant. You're very well read.
We have to. When you try to convince people on campus, you got to try to at least bring these to the table. Even your idea. Is it fair to say? And I'm referring to you as a professional historian. There's nobody that gainsays Christianity with regard to help for the poor. Whether you go hospitals, whether you go poor currently, disaster relief. Again, we're the biggest religion numerically right now. Over 2 billion, and I'm not accounting for whatever. But numerically, we are pretty strong. So I'll give that caveat. But is it fair to say there's really not another religion on the planet that gainsays our concern for the Imago Dei and the poor and the marginalized? Is that fair?
Right. So you have Hinduism.
Yes.
That says if the poor is poor, it's because they did something wrong in a previous life, and they are suffering. So that they can be reincarnated in a higher level in the next life. And if you stop their suffering, you're preventing them from being reincarnated in a better life. So just step over them as they lie in the gutter and let them suffer.
Yep.
My daughter went on a mission trip to Thailand, and they send the young girls from the farms into the city to be prostitutes and send the money back to the farm. And if they're a really good daughter, they'll make a lot of money and send it back to the farm. And they tell these girls, if you're a really good prostitute in your next life, you get to be reincarnated as a man. Dear God. My wife says that's from going from bad to worse.
Right.
And so it doesn't talk about helping the poor. And then you have Islam.
Right.
Traditionally, Islam considers those who are handicapped as cursed of God. There was no Islamic Red Cross.
Right.
So the Red Cross was started by Henry Dunant in Switzerland. He's the first recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize. And so he started the Red Cross to go in the battlefields and pick up the wounded and nurse them. And Clara Barton went over there to help him, and then she started the American Red Cross. There was no Islamic Red Cross.
Right.
And so he helped take his organization and in Turkey turned it into the Red Crescent.
Oh, wow.
But it was a Christian that started the Red Crescent that takes care, right?
Yeah.
So you look at the history of hospitals. It's largely been a Christian movement. You have the Sisters of Charity, the Sisters of St. Joseph in the Middle Ages. They started the Hotel Dieu, the first hospital there in Paris.
Incredible.
And then they started hundreds of hospitals. And then you had, Ben Franklin helped start the first hospital in America, in Pennsylvania, because the doctors would go to people's houses.
Of course.
Right? And the cornerstone mentions dedicated to Christ. But then you have these Sisters of St. Joseph coming over, and they started the first hospital west of the Mississippi in St. Louis. And actually, like 8 of the top 10 hospital organizations in America were started by religious denominations. And unfortunately, they're being bought out by these big corporate conglomerates, and who knows what's going to happen to the chapels and these things. And
I had an agnostic student a couple of years ago asked that very question. Why are there all these saints' names for hospital? He didn't understand at all. But that's probably a whole nother discussion about wipe out history. That is an intentional thing. to wipe that out, no compare contrast, and then you can believe something like a Hitchens book that religion poisons everything, especially Christianity.
The Howard Zinn, People's History of the United States.
Yes, but he would use bottom up in a whole different way than the way you're using it. So, but as that being a primary text for college age students, anyway, we'll draw down here, and let me. I'll just move. I was going to ask you a little bit about property. Maybe next time I ask you about why property is so important. You mentioned it at the front end, but I think I wanted you to expand on it a bit. You've already summarized the crucial role that monotheistic religion, or at least our particular version of monotheism, is particularly important for what we want to maintain and achieve. But so, let me just ask you this: if we are bottom up and a higher power plays a huge role, are you advocate? You're not advocating for what the founders didn't advocate, a national religion. But I did want you to comment on the idea of course this needs to be inculcated, though. Not only a history of Christianity, and not just a one-sided, all we hear about is inquisitions, witch hunts, and crusades. You can make anything sound bad by just isolating the worst parts. But the idea that what do you think would be a good deployment? Have we done it before, where it was just kind of where Christianity and Bible training was woven in to the educational system pre-Dewey, or what are your thoughts on, as far as if you were given the keys of power right now, how would you implement it without it becoming kind of a top-down? It is a religion of the heart. It is a voluntary religion. So I know I'm throwing you a curveball here, but how do you think it should be? Should we go back to a former way it was implemented? Was it working?
Right. So what we have is Europe and America, Christianity being different. So Europe, you first had a Catholic Western Europe, and then when the Muslims were invading and conquering, surrounding Vienna, you had, at the same time, Martin Luther starts the Reformation. Right. And the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V of Spain feels like he's faced with a double dilemma: the Protestant Reformation on one side and this Muslim invasion surrounding Vienna on the other side. Wow. So he makes a deal with the Protestants, Peace of Augsburg, 1555, which basically says, believe whatever you want in your kingdom, let's just work together against this Islamic invasion. And so now we have these different kings believing different things. So Northern Germany and Sweden were Lutheran, Switzerland Calvinist, Scotland Presbyterian, Holland Dutch Reformed, England Anglican. But it was whatever the king believed, the kingdom had to believe. Right. If you did not, it was considered treason. And so people would mass migrate from one country to the other. Then you began to have separatists that said, wait a second, it's your conscience that God's concerned about. So one of the Baptist founders in England, Thomas Helwise, he dies in the Newgate prison. He would write pamphlets that say, if the king can stand there on the day of judgment and answer for your conscience, fine, believe whatever the king tells you to believe. But if the king is not going to be there on the day of judgment, you're accountable to God for your own conscience. Absolutely. Well, kings didn't want this. They wanted to be the go-between between you and God. Then the Quakers come along. And William Penn spends 8 months in the Tower of London because he believes in conscience. He says, force makes hypocrites, 'tis persuasion only that makes converts. Well, that's why you had these different separatists, and the Pilgrims were separatists, fleeing to America, and the Quakers fleeing to America. And they embraced this concept that your worship of God is only pleasing to God if it is voluntarily given. And so they incorporated this into the different state constitutions and into the federal government. So in other words, they took away the government mandate, not because they wanted to diminish and get rid of religion, but because they wanted it to be freely given. Right. And so then you have a wave of Catholics coming over, and then you have a wave of Jews coming over, and they're like, okay, we don't want to force you, but then you have the atheists coming over, and then ultimately the Sharia Islams, and what do? They want to flip it and outlaw Christianity. So it's actually backfired. And so they're now running to reinterpret the founders by saying, oh, they wanted to get rid of religion. No. They didn't want the government to force it because they wanted to maintain this freedom of conscience.
Right. Excellent. Last question, at least for now. Maybe we'll get to do this again. Your last two books, Who's the King in America and Socialism, From Plato to the Present. What would be the highest, if you could achieve anything with these, what would be your outcome for at least these last two? What would you love to see?
A revival.
Absolutely.
People repent. That all liberty is individual and all repentance is individual. That God is a jealous God. He loves you and He wants you to love Him back. And the more you love someone, the more you want that someone to love you back.
Absolutely.
God loves each of us infinitely. He has an infinite desire for you to love Him back. But love by definition must be voluntary.
Absolutely.
The moment He would force it, it evaporates. It may be obedience, maybe submission, but it's not love. So think of it from God's perspective. Here He is. He exists for eternity. He knows everything. It's impossible for Him not to know everything. He's all powerful, and He makes things that obey Him. And He makes the planets, and they follow laws of planetary motion. He makes the little atoms and the electrons and neutrons, and they follow laws, and everything follows laws. And it's almost like He said, been there, done that. I can make things that obey me. And somewhere in eternity past, God said, you know what? I would like someone in my image that could love me. And so so He creates this virtual world that we live in, and you really can't control much except your will. And you can, and so somewhere in your life, you're presented with the choice. Are you going to love God and seek Him and believe in Jesus and the forgiveness of His sins? Or are you just going to ignore God and go off on your own selfish way? And He won't force you. And if you think of it, so once this present age is over, I use a little computer analogy.
Yes.
Did I share this?
Yes, you did. It was great. In fact, we've got it up on our site.
Oh,
the
okay.
computer analogy is great.
But it's this idea that, if you were God and you wanted to populate heaven with people that love you, you had to give them the choice to love you in order for their love to be love.
Absolutely.
And so He created this age, this however long it is, this period of time, but each of us are made in His image, and we have this choice to love Him and have faith in Him and serve Him or reject Him.
Absolutely. Hopefully you can see why. Somebody asked me to describe, somebody didn't know Bill at all. How would you describe Bill Federer? And I said, deep drawers and a great retrieval system. Brilliant. Thank you so much for being.
You're brilliant.
Oh, no, it's
I'm
incredible.
very impressed.
We hope we can do this again. This is going to be, it'll be really good. And just a really quick kind of footnote to put alongside his current book, and you should get all of his books. And that's not just, that's a real, I own most of them. You can find that at American Minute. That's where you'd like it. They can even get access to the book. Isn't in print yet, or is it?
Well, actually, I have it this week.
Okay, this week it'll be. So if you like the Dead Tree version, he'll have it. But just something to augment your own personal. We are all about autodidacts that teach themselves. You can get Dinesh D'Souza's The United States of Socialism. Great augment to Bill's work here. As well as if you go to Biola's website, you can see their economist, Dr. Lawrence, I believe is his name. He gets interviewed by a guy named Scott Ray on the Jesus question and the ability to defend the idea that just because you're using some parables doesn't make Jesus and the early Christians into socialist or even proto-socialist. So these are things, given our current situation, that Christians should be wrestling with and understanding in their biblical studies. So with that, thank you very, very much. It was an honor.
Thank you, Dr. Joe.
See you guys soon.